So, Dennis, what I wanted to talk to you about today was to explode a few of these myths that are starting to be created around the submarine contract and what we could or couldn't have done in 2015-16 when we chose the attack class French naval group conventional submarine, and talk a little bit about AUKUS and its importance and perhaps what the future looks like for submarines in Australia. You and I were intimately involved back in 2015-16. I was the Minister for Industry, then the Minister for Defence Industry, and you were the Secretary of the Department of Defence. Can you just confirm with me what I think seems to be the case, is certainly the case? We didn't actually have an option for a nuclear-powered submarine back in 2015-16.
That is right, Christopher. Certainly, when I made inquiries of the Americans, they were quite firm that without a nuclear industry of some sort, it would be very difficult for Australia to acquire a nuclear-powered submarine, and they wouldn't be in a position to, in fact, provide one.
So that's the reason for the competitive evaluation process, and that's why the attack class won against the German and Japanese offerings, and we felt back in 2015-16 that we had the best conventional long-range submarine that was available to Australia.
That is right, Chris, and I think in terms of conventional submarines, that probably remains the case. The Japanese were never prepared to share with us their best technology, and the Germans had a very good Australian industry involvement plan, but the capability of their submarine was somewhat below the French. The French were in fact prepared to share some of their more sensitive technology, and everyone involved in the process, including an American advisory team, agreed with the end result.
Yeah, absolutely. So as a well-known and considered foreign and defence analyst, what would you say are the big changes in probably the recent year or two that have caused the US to change its mind, the UK to decide to engage with us quite so deeply, and for the Australian government to take what was a big step in cancelling the naval group contract and beginning a nuclear-powered submarine industry?
All right, Christopher, look, if you step through that a bit at a time, first of all, the Australian government has not broken any contract with the French. What the Australian government has done is exercised its right under the contract to walk away from it at a particular point. In terms of what's changed, I think for the Americans, and it really is the Americans that are the important bit here rather than the British, I think for the Americans, the big thing that has changed has been the strategic environment, particularly with China. The second thing that has changed has been the advent of modular nuclear reactors that can be put in nuclear-powered submarines. That technology has been around for a decade or so, so it was around in 2015-16, but it was very new. And what's coming online now is a second generation of that technology, so everyone is far more comfortable with it and, in fact, terribly confident about it. I think with the British, one, they are a nuclear power. They do manufacture nuclear-powered submarines themselves, and I think having left Brexit, this was an opportunity for them to show a global presence, if you like.
Yeah, I agree. I completely agree with that assessment. I think that the British, looking globally rather than towards Europe, having been freed from Europe through Brexit, had an opportunity to think in a different way than they've thought for many decades. I also think that the advent of the Biden administration and their genuine pivot to China, to the Indo-Pacific and the challenge from China, has meant that they were much more open to the idea of sharing technology. So really the big game changer is AUKUS. So where would you put AUKUS on the list of the most significant things in the last several decades, the last potentially 70 years in Australia's foreign and defence posture?
Well, in terms of defence capability, it's probably the biggest decision we've taken in 70 years. In terms of the ANZUS alliance, I think one needs to be a little bit more measured. For instance, the decision to establish the North West Cape Naval Communication Facility in Western Australia in the 1960s, that was very important. The decision to establish Pine Gap in the 70s, that was very important. So there have been other very, very big and decisive decisions within the context of ANZUS. AUKUS is particularly important because it brings together Australia, the US and the UK. It is not an alliance, as a lot of commentators refer to it. It is not a pact. It is essentially a defence industry and technology information sharing arrangement.
Absolutely. I mean, things like hypersonics and missiles will all be part of the AUKUS architecture over time. It's a signature achievement of the current government, and I know obviously you want to remain bipartisan, but it's true to say, I think, that this is, it surprised me that the government was able to keep it so much under wraps until very much the last minute, but it is a signature achievement of the government. Things like this come along very rarely, and I think one of the reasons we need to talk more about foreign and defence policy in Australia is that the Australian public are often unprepared for these big shifts in government policy, but this one will have long-term implications for Australia's military capability, which we often underestimate in Australia, but the rest of the world doesn't. In the Asia-Pacific, Indo-Pacific region, though, I don't think that nations in the Indo-Pacific will be concerned. Some might, but most of them won't be concerned. I think most of them will welcome the fact that the US and now the UK is being tied even more into the Indo-Pacific than they were before.
Yeah, Christopher, just stepping through that, I think that's right. First of all, it is, I think, one of the great achievements of the Morrison government. There's no question of that. Also, I think you've got to acknowledge the role played by the opposition. The opposition was briefed on the matter and agreed with the decision. The opposition could have taken a different stance, and it was absolutely vital that this have bipartisan support. And without bipartisan support, this project, I don't think, could have gone anywhere. So I think that's important to acknowledge. Secondly, I think it's understandable that the French are upset. There are probably some things around the edges that might have been done better, but at the end of the day, I think it was always going to be an ambush in the middle of the night. I think it's going to take a little bit of time to repair the relationship with France, but that will happen. Don't forget, if we in New Zealand were prepared to repair the relationship with France after the Rainbow Warrior and after their nuclear testing in the South Pacific, I think over time, France will be prepared to repair its relationship with us, bearing in mind that it remains a very important player in the Indo-Pacific, and it's important for us that France remains involved in the Indo-Pacific, as it will. Moving on to the region, I think the reaction within the region to the announcement has been fairly predictable. I don't think there's been any reaction which I think would have surprised anyone. Indeed, I've been delighted with the sense of humour that the North Koreans have shown. I didn't know they had a sense of humour, but coming out expressing concern about how this could lead to an arms race, I thought that was probably one of the best jokes of the year.